Hi class, welcome to Module 2. So we're moving along in our first week of summer, and we are looking at social class and poverty. This is going to be a running theme throughout all of sociology. We talk about the differences of how people are affected by what's going on in society. And especially in social problems, it's really important to explore this. So as we start to look at this, you'll see that we need to understand what it means to be poor, how it affects our belief system, what goes into place. As I write this, I was thinking of those of you that are the typical college student and those of you beyond. You know, probably all of us has experienced poverty at some form or another. Very few of us, especially as college students, we've done without. We don't have the money, but it didn't mean that we were absolutely in that poverty category. For many of the students that I have, especially here at Mansfield, they've truly been in poverty, that they've faced food insecurity, that there hasn't been a significant, uh, there hasn't been enough food to put on a table. My husband was an Army brat, and his father was a non-commissioned personnel. Oftentimes, by the end of the month, there was nothing to live on, but what was stocked up in the cupboard, because the salaries are so poor for our enlisted men, and to have a family is very difficult. It was even worse in the past. At least today they qualify for food stamps and assistance. Isn't that a sad reality of our society? So as we start looking at the social problem, we need to think about it beyond our own experiences, but step ourselves into looking at what goes on in the process. And with that, you're going to see you have a video and a couple YouTube things to look at. You also have a look at the diversity wheel here as we explore things. I recommend that you not necessarily view these in your PowerPoint frame, but hold down Control and log over into the categories, such as this one that I ask you, what's the difference? How we look at this load-in wheel that your book gives us at a little bit deeper level as you explore this. So let's look quickly at the PowerPoints as we begin this process, and let me move the recording device to hit us in the right place. Now here's the load-in wheel that I just talked about, as you see, with less involvement. And what we look at is social stratification equals social inequality. Social inequality means that there are significant things that come into place that affect our characteristics and where we fit into society. We're going to see throughout the course that many of these come into effect. And first, you think about age. And the fact is, as a student, sometimes you are treated at a different level than if you're considered a true adult. And think about this, the whole issue of aging, which we will talk about as well, which is a significant social problem. The social problems of race and ethnicity and gender and disability. And in fact, in this course, we step over to look at disability as a separate area which is not indicated in our book. Education, the sexuality orientation, our sex, our gender, all comes into place. And then these outside, we can see these experiences that come into place. Again, as you're popping over, you're going to see that these go into a little more difficulty and give you some background of information here. So with that said, as you explore your module here, you look at the understanding of wealth. Wealth is a value of assets owned by a household at any one point in time and is considered the most important thing at determining one's economic inequality in society, as well as um, knowing what you own and what will come into place. It's really defined by the money earned in one's work. And that's different than the whole picture out there. Wealth is measured by both gross and net value. And net value, um, if I can pull this down a bit, um, is basically our owned our whole amount that's into place, so that it's minus the amount of debt. This is pretty significant for the American population and for most um, modern societies, because we live in a new creation of debt that hangs over our heads. I remember my neuropsychologist friend talking about the fact that he would pay off his student loans about the time that his son entered college, because this debt is hanging over your head on a regular basis, and we are in debt at a very strong level. It's interesting in an American society too that we don't save like we used to, and for good reason, because of this level of debt and this need to pay regularly and living from paycheck to paycheck, but also the fact that the economy doesn't support saving in the same way it may have in the past. In the 1950s, you could get 5% interest on a passbook account. You don't even know what a passbook account is, but as we look at savings accounts today, you're lucky to get 1 or 2% interest on your savings. So it makes it very hard to move forward. And there is some interesting. So what does it mean to be poor? Well, poor is two different types. Now, I talked about early as we looked at some of the material, we all know what it's like to be poor. We may have been in relative poverty due to the situation that we were falling behind other people as a student. We weren't getting as well as along. Perhaps we were driving a junk car, but we were still surviving. Or we could have been where we lacked the basic necessities such as food and shelter and income. And that is absolute poverty. Now, why is poverty a social problem? Well, again, this is why we determine what social problems are out there. It depends on our society, and the society has called the attention to the fact that there is significant difference, and people who are poor don't survive well, and there's many problems as we start to analyze why this is a social problem. Now think about in the 1930s when the Great Depression occurred and everyone was poor. It was a social problem, but 90% of the country was in relative to absolute poverty. And there was, you were surviving. Today, we see that market differentiation that occurs, which makes it even more difficult, and therefore we define it more as a social poverty, as a social problem. So the federal definition of poverty comes into place, and these guidelines are are set up every year of how much is poverty, where it's at, and these poverty thresholds. Our book gives us the information from 2013. This data is formulated on the pictures that were out there in the 1960s and 70s, so that it has not made significant change. So when we look at what's the federal poverty guideline here of a family of 3, that's a mother and 2 children, we're looking at under $20,000 a year, and it's higher in Alaska and Hawaii because of the difference in cost of living. Now think about living in California or thinking about living in Boston, one of the most expensive places in the Northeast. And this is the dollar amount that is brought into place that is considered poverty. Our categories makes us different. So who are the poor? This is an interesting question. You're going to see this on your midterm exam. Who are the poor? They tend to be racial and ethnic minorities. They tend to be children. They tend to be families headed by single parents, especially mothers. Mothers are more likely to be in poverty. They are people who live in certain geographical area, more likely the South. But percentage-wise, you need to remember that the number of people that are poor, that the white are the majority. But percentage-wise, compared to the number of Hispanic and African American, or Black as we call them, because not all people with, as we go into race, we'll talk about this a great deal more, but those with dark skin that fall in that category are more likely to be poor. Now, we're going to have to watch that. And again, as we think about how much these chapters will intertwine, 50% of Blacks are in the middle class. So we need to not stereotype as we move forward. So that's part of the characteristics as we start looking at this. So let's look at the perspectives. Let me pull this up a little bit as you explore it. In fact, I'll leave it there. Functionalists assume that not everyone in society can or should be equal, that there should be a difference between people, that there are many sorters that come into place. And from this perspective, inequality is a necessity to social order, because somebody's got to clean our houses, or someone has to work the field, that someone has that, and by talent of the society rewards those with more power and wealth and income, and that puts it into place. Functionalists are often criticized for the value argument, because does that football player deserve so much more? And when we think about football players, it's the stars that earn so much more, and the average football player that's not a star, that's on the field, that gets the concussion on the regular basis, may not actually be being paid at that same level. And what's more valuable? I once had a nurse tell me how much more important her job was as a nurse than my job as a teacher, that she had their lives in her hand. And I said, but I have their lives in my hands as well. My husband's an auto mechanic. Who has your life in your hands more than an auto mechanic? And yet we look at that difference of what's valued by our society. We pay based on value. Conflict theory looks at the inequality of the system and how it creates this division. And again, we'll drop back to Karl Marx, that early founder in sociology, who saw one's social class as the sole determinant by the position of that economic system, that we were either a worker or an owner, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie. And so are we at that point who gets the power? In conflict theory, we look at this division, that economic factors and wealth come in to give power. Then there's the prestige that comes in place based on the social respect given for a doctor or a professor. Even though a professor may not earn that money, they may have the prestige based on the situation, and that power comes into place, and that's one's goals despite the other oppositions to other. Now, C. Wright Mills, you've heard that name before. If you recall the sociological imagination, he argued that the United States is ruled by the power elite. Now, C. Wright Mills is writing in the 1950s as he's talking about that. Think about it today, and we can see the power elite, the ability for very powerful people and the money groups to put forward the running of the country. And we can see this in our last election. Two very, very powerful, rich people running for the presidency, and that their dollars were there, and they were supported by some very strong dollar amount. Now, again, remember the feminist theory. It will talk about this in many of the chapters, but especially important here as we talk about economics, social class, and poverty. The feminist scholars define the welfare state as an arena for public struggle, and it's shaped by men. And therefore, women are more disadvantaged in this. You can see the conflict perspectives, and we often drop feminists under conflict. Remember, it can fall in any of the other categories as well, but it really drives the whole perspective of the welfare policies in this country as we start to explore that. Finally, the interactionist perspective draws our attention to the individual. I think that's always important that you think of the micro theory here. And it looks at how different classes communicate through different symbols, different languages come into place, even as we look at how we interact. And these meanings of the symbols or constrain their advancements by social forces. And these symbols continue to produce social inequality. So let's talk about poverty in general. People say, well, the poor will always be with us, and they need to be with us, and we need them to work in the system. But there's a real difference of how you can consider that. You see, there's no evidence that we always need to treat people at that very different level. Now, I'm going to sound very communistic by those statements, and I had students complain about the reality of studying these particular topics. I think it's important that you think about how you can work and how you can get someplace. In the United States, we always say, well, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, part of the videos you're watching today will show you that if we start in poverty to begin with, or in the lower class, the likelihood of us leaving that, no matter what we do, is very limited. And why is it there? Is there a culture of poverty, the set values and norms? Some say that the people are socialized differently and they pass these values on to their children. When we study parenting styles, we know that those are poor are focused more on getting food in their stomach and things done than focusing on getting their homework and getting them to other places. Is that the culture of poverty? Or is that the situation of society? So lots of interesting things for you to explore as you look at this. So look at some of the solutions. The consequences of poverty include limited access to health care. We can think of that very clearly of those that are receiving such things as Medicaid. Children in Tioga County, Pennsylvania, don't have access to a dentist. They basically have to drive all the way to Scranton. Are you going to get the health care that the family needs? So there's limited access to medical care. It improved under the Affordable Care Act, but it's still difficult, and it's the working poor who were hurt the most by it. There's the issue of food insecurity. So when families don't have enough money for activities or healthy lives. For us here in, again, Tioga County, PA, more than 50%, or we look even in Mansfield, more than 50% of the students qualify for free or reduced lunches in our school system. So we have this high experience of poverty in place, and these children can get food then in the school. What happens when school closes? There are significant numbers in our area, and we're looking at the major areas here in our own region that have high levels of food insecurity between Chemung, Steuben, Tioga, Bradford, Potter counties. And even the access, they can end up in food deserts or where food is unaffordable. Other things that are strongly come into place here is the lack of affordable housing. Um, and when we think about that, we think about cities especially. So if we're living outside Washington, D.C., a one-bedroom apartment is going to cost us $1,500 a month, and you're working on a minimum wage salary. How do you survive in those situations? So we see that particular situation, but affordable housing can be difficult too, even in rural areas, or especially when there's been a boom and not all people are part of that. And we saw that with the high level of drilling that occurred when the fracking first started in our area, and housing prices shot way up, and those that were working in the normal businesses like Walmart or even students could not afford the housing in the area. Um, so how have we responded to this in the United States? We set up welfare policies in the 1935. We started the Social Security Act. We started Social Security for older adults, but it also brought us into looking at aid on a regular basis, and work relief and general assistance. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty. At that time, 25% of the United States children were considered in poverty. Today, the numbers are basically the same. So there's a lot of things that come into place. So think about this as an issue as you explore it. Again, as I told you before, you have a number of things to do along with this. You have information here on the poverty in the United States. And again, I recommend you hold control down, and this will bring you directly into your films on demand if you have it set up. But it will ask you for your student ID, the Mansfield University, and you can still get into films on demand very easily. So that did not change. I went to a library lecture this week on the new changes to the library. YouTube, you have two to watch, and this one especially is very
There's a chart
interesting
I saw
as
recently
you
that I can't
start
get out
looking
of my
at
head.
wealth
A
and
Harvard business
inequality
professor and
in America.
economist asked more than 5,000.
Um, with that, I look forward to your discussions that will follow. And if you have any questions, make sure you let me know. We'll be moving forward in the class, lots of things to discuss. And your discussion this week will focus exactly on that. What do you think can be done to solve this social problem of poverty? And where do we go from here? All right. Have a great week.